Hola. Estamos.
Hello, we will begin in 1 minute.
Estamos comenzando.
Cómo el gaming se convirtió en el motor del metaverso. James Gatto, Sheppard, Mullin, Estados Unidos. Patrick Sweeney, Interactive Entertainment Law Group, Estados Unidos. Moderador, Aldo.
US. Moderator, Aldo, Fabrizio, Módica. Bareiro, Módica, Abogados, Paraguay. We continue with our sessions. We have Aldo, Fabrizio, Módica, partner of Bareiro, Módica, Abogados, Paraguay, who is going to be alone here, but he will be accompanied with two great presenters who we will be introducing. Aldo, the panel is yours. Thank you very much. The perfect person to talk about gaming, undoubtedly it's you. Thank you very much. The truth is to be a pleasure to be here. I always say that I have to talk about video games because it's in part of my passions, intellectual property, video games, and sports once in a while. So today we have a very interesting panel, which is how gaming became the engine of the metaverse, as you've seen because of the previous presentations. What is fundamental about the metaverse is always related to video games, to gaming. So today we have a top-level panel with two heavyweights in the legal industry in the United States. And we will be talking in our panel about how the gaming structure has been evolving in metaverse, its characteristics, relationship with the brands, issues of intellectual property, some causes, and more than anything else, we were focusing on video games from the point of view related to the blockchain technology. Before introducing our panelists who will be here remotely, as it was mentioned by Martin, I would like to thank Professor David Greensman, who is a great friend. David Greensman, he helped the organization of the panel suggest the names and some of the topics. And in this sense, there is a book, a very important book about video games called Mastering the Game, that is like the Bible for the legal industry of video games. He recently launched his second edition. And I am talking about this game because many colleagues and friends of ASIPI have collaborated with the book, in particular what is related to intellectual property and video games in the Latin American region. The book is available for free in the website of WIPO. And if you enter the WIPO, you say Mastering the Game, and you will be able to download it for free. So with no further ado, I would like to briefly read the CV of our speakers. First, we have James Gatto. Mr. Gatto co-directs the blockchain team of Sheppard, Mullin, and its video games. He has been an intellectual advisor of companies that work with blockchain, NSD, games, virtual worlds, metaverse, virtual reality, augmented reality, and social media. For more than 30 years, he has been provided strategic advice on intellectual property and technological rights, especially those promoted by new business models and disruptive technologies. His practice focuses on blockchain, including blockchain games, cryptocurrency, NFT, interactive entertainment, metaverse, virtual worlds, games, virtual reality, augmented reality, sports, fantasy, and electronic sports, digital arts, and online gambling games. He advises clients on intellectual property strategies, agreement and development, and publication of service agreements, lines of technologies, and regulatory matters. Mr. Gatto has been involved with blockchain since 2012, and he has been acknowledged as one of the leaders by organizations such as Best Lawyers in America in 2021 to 22, Cryptocurrency, Blockchain, and FinTech Trailblazer by the National Law Journal in 2018, and Opinion Leader on Blockchain Cryptocurrency by the National Law Review in 2018. We also will listen to Mr. Patrick Sweeney. Patrick Sweeney is one of the leading attorneys in the gaming industry, and he worked as an internal and external advisor on several companies throughout his career for more than 20 years in the gaming industry. He has developed a series of agreements which resulted in the commercial launch of more than 300 games in all of the distribution platforms and territory. He has represented clients with regards to gaming rights in more than important television and cinema properties, and he has negotiated license or technology and other agreements related to the gaming industry. He has written and several articles in publications for the Daily Journal, Game Developer Magazine, and others. Patrick is also a frequent speaker on legal issues related to the gaming industry, and which on behalf of organizations such as the Law Seminar International, International Game Developer Association, American Bar Association, and Beverly Hills Bar. Patrick is also a founding member and president of Bio Game Bar Association, an organization that you can only become a member by invitation and gathers most of the legal professionals in the gaming industry. The panel will be divided in 3 sessions. The first one will be a brief introduction by Mr. James Gatto about the blockchain technology and video games. Then we will have about 15 minutes for a second phase for QA session with a kind of a 30-minute interview. And then if we have no more time, we will have 10 final questions for QA from the attendees. With no further ado, if you're ready, we would like to welcome you, and we leave you on with James Gatto, who will be talking about gaming and the blockchain technology. Please go ahead, James. Muchas gracias.
Have the opportunity to talk to you about blockchain games. So as mentioned, we're going to do just a very brief overview of some of the basics of blockchain and blockchain games, and then we're going to do a panel discussion. So briefly, what is blockchain? So blockchain is a form of distributed ledger technology. It's like a database for storing transaction data, but it's different. So when we think about a ledger, we think of these old leather books with pages, with lines on them, and you have transaction information on each line. And when you fill up a page, you go to the next page. With blockchains, there's blocks instead of pages, and blocks get filled with transactions, and when you fill up a block, you go to the next page. And one of the things, or to the next block rather, one of the things that's different though about blockchain is instead of there being a single ledger like there was historically, you have copies of the entire blockchain are stored on multiple, what's referred to as nodes, which are just different computers in the network. And the other thing that's important is that these nodes are controlled and managed by different entities. And it's the fact that you have these multiple nodes that are managed by multiple entities that you hear blockchain referred to as kind of a distributed technology. So it's not in a single centralized control, it's multiple entities over multiple locations. And any changes that are made to the blockchain are broadcast to all of the nodes, and the changes must be approved by the network. And this network approval because it's not done by a single entity, but rather by the multiple node operators, that's why you hear blockchain being referred to as decentralized. So it's not under control of a single entity. So what are these blocks? So as I mentioned, there's a group of transactions that get stored in a block, and then they get validated by the network. Assuming they're valid transactions and the different nodes validate them, then the block transaction data is written to the blockchain. And the blocks are really a chain of blocks, and it's that chain of blocks that form what's referred to as the blockchain. So how are these blocks chained together? The way they're chained together is that once block one is written to the blockchain, a hash value is created. And a hash is just, there's an algorithm that's run based on the contents of block one. It generates a long string of alphanumeric characters, and that's essentially the hash value. And the hash value from block one gets written to block two. And so what happens is if anyone ever goes back and tries to change the data in block one, the new hash value for block one won't match what was written to block two, and you'll know that someone tried to tamper with that. And that particular blockchain, that particular instance, that change will not be validated because it will not be deemed to be a valid change, and that chain will be disregarded by the rest of the nodes. So in this way, and some other aspects of cryptography, once data is written to a blockchain, it's basically immutable. It cannot be changed without that change being detected and generally disregarded. So you also hear the terms cryptocurrency and digital wallet. The cryptocurrency is just a digital currency where the transactions are stored on a ledger and the blockchain basically validates and processes those transactions. And the way in which you enter into these transactions is with what's called a digital wallet. And a digital wallet is really just a piece of software. Think of it like a browser, except it has a public key and a private key. And so if I want to send money to cryptocurrency to Patrick, I would need to know his public key, and I would need to put my private key to sign the transaction. So it's very much like a public key is very much like an email address. If I want to send an email to somebody, I need to know their address, but I can't send something from their account without being logged in and using my password, which is like the private key. So once a transaction is sent from a wallet, it gets validated by the network, and assuming it's a valid transaction, what ends up happening is my public key, which is the identifier for my wallet, there will be a ledger entry that says, if I sent a Bitcoin to Patrick, it will say that his wallet has 1 Bitcoin, and that's what gets recorded on the ledger. It's important to understand cryptocurrency is not stored in a wallet. Wallet is kind of a bit of a misnomer here. It's just your wallet ID gets associated on the ledger with whatever the asset is, whether it's cryptocurrency or an NFT. So what are NFTs? So NFTs, unlike cryptocurrency, which are fungible commodities, meaning each Bitcoin is the same as every other Bitcoin, with non-fungible tokens, typically the token represents some unique asset. And that's what the non-fungible part implies. When we think about NFTs, there's really kind of 2 parts to it. The first is the token, which represents ownership or rights to something, and then the something. The something is typically either an asset, which is either physical or digital, or some type of entitlement, which I'll talk about in a second. So I think one easy way to think about this is like the token is like title to a car, and the asset is the car. And so on a title certificate, there's a vehicle identification number that corresponds to the unique vehicle identification number with the car. That gets stored in a database, and it shows who owns that particular asset. It's essentially how NFTs work as well. So just take a little bit of a deeper dive. The way NFTs are created is that they're minted by a smart contract. And as I'll touch on in a second, a smart contract is really just computer code that's used to create and then manage subsequent sales of the NFT. And the token has a token ID. It's a unique ID that identifies that token. And then there's metadata that is included when you go to create the token. And the metadata can include a number of things, including what is the asset that the NFT refers to. There might be an image that shows an example of what the asset looks like. And then importantly, there's typically a reference to where the file if it's a digital asset, where the file is located or some other way of identifying the file. Because typically the asset is not stored on the blockchain. The token is stored on the blockchain and the asset is somewhere else. And so just like with cryptocurrency, as I mentioned with wallets before, the way an NFT, the way the token part works is once the unique token ID is generated and someone purchases it, that token ID gets associated with their wallet ID, and that gets recorded on the blockchain. And that just says that this token is owned by this wallet owner. But the asset, as I mentioned, is typically somewhere else. So you need to understand where that file is. And part of what that's part of what the metadata serves its purpose for. So just one quick thing on smart contracts, as I mentioned, they're typically just computer code. They're not a legal contract. And the code in this case creates the token and it manages the resale. And one of the things that's interesting with NFTs is that as part of when you create the token, one of the things you can specify in the metadata is whether you're going to impose a resale royalty. And if so, the smart contract, when it's created, will be programmed in a way such that every time that NFT is resold, a percentage of the sale will go back to the original issuer of the NFT to a specified wallet. Now, that can be collected automatically. This is a way for issuers to not just get a sale once on a digital item, but to get the resale each time it occurs. So as I mentioned, the NFTs, the assets are typically not stored on a blockchain. So where are they stored? They can be stored in a centralized server. So if a company creates their own NFTs, they could store it on a server that they host, a file server. They could set up an AWS, a cloud solution where they have a cloud-based storage, but typically that still will be under control of a single entity. And so those are referred to as centralized storage, or you can have decentralized storage. So there's a number of alternatives out there. The most common one that's used is called IPFS, which stands for Interplanetary File System. And it's a distributed network, kind of like blockchain. It's a distributed network of storage devices under control of different entities. And the network protocol stores data on different ones of those devices. And so when you want to retrieve it, you typically need to know the identity of the content, which is specified in the metadata, and it'll retrieve the file when you need it. There's a growing number of variations of NFTs. So most of the NFTs you hear about are static NFTs, which means that the metadata is fixed once the NFT is minted and created on a blockchain. So if a NFT represents a particular image, it's always going to represent that image, and that won't change. There's another class of NFTs that are just gaining popularity that are called dynamic NFTs. And with dynamic NFTs, the metadata can change based on external conditions, so based on certain data or other types of things. So in a simple example I'll give you here that relates to game context is that, as you see in the center here, you might have a NFT-based avatar in a game, and the base avatar or the newbie version is pretty plain and simple. And as the player plays the game and maybe demonstrates proficiency and kills or accomplishes some quests with an arrow, the metadata can get updated to reflect that, and you can unlock a trait. For example, certain archer skills that might be available once you kill a certain number of competitors or monsters with your arrow, for example. And so as you can see on the right, the metadata gets updated, and it doesn't just upgrade the characteristics of the player, but rather it also can change the picture that's associated with the NFT. So you may see there in the bottom right, you may go from the newbie avatar to an avatar that represents an archer. So in this way, NFTs can change over time based on updated data. We're seeing all kinds of things being tokenized in the context of games, all types of virtual items. I mentioned avatars, accessories such as digital fashion or other skins for weapons, land, particularly in Metaverse-based games, game art, and so on. We're also seeing a lot of NFTs around collectibles like NBA Top Shot, where video highlights of sports events, digital trading cards, and much more. Now, I mentioned earlier, NFTs can also represent entitlement. So an example of entitlement would be tickets. So you may have a live or virtual concert, and an NFT can represent a right to the ticket to enter that event. If it's a live event, it may be for a particular seat, for example. But we also see entitlements to things like exclusive content or access to a private Discord channel or a meet and greet with a celebrity. So it's something that's not just a file, but it's something that gives you access or entitlement to something else. We've also seen a number of physical objects be tokenized through NFTs. So at a high level, it's important to understand the IP rights that are associated and property rights associated with NFTs. In most cases, the user will typically own the token, so they can buy and sell the token, but they typically only get a license to the digital asset that's referenced in the metadata. So they don't typically own the underlying asset. And one of the things I like to point out is that many places that sell NFTs actually misstate this. And this can lead to consumer protection claims and false advertising and things like that if people think they actually own the underlying asset when in fact they only have a license. So what is the license? The license can vary. We've seen, many existing brands, if they use their IP as part of an asset in NFT, they tend to be protective of that IP, and they typically will issue a personal, non-commercial license for the asset for users to display it. They can display the token for resale, but that's pretty much it. In other cases, we see commercial licenses where people can actually commercialize the content, subject to, in some cases, some limitations. But typically, the underlying asset associated with the NFT, that the creator is going to retain the copyright, and so they will own the underlying copyright. And so you, as a user, you only get what rights they specifically grant via the license. And one of the things that's important when you're issuing an NFT is, just like with any other digital media, if you're going to be using a digital asset associated with that NFT, you want to make sure you do a rights clearance. You want to make sure that you either own all the IP in that digital asset, or you at least have a license to grant whatever scope of license you're granting as part of that NFT. Okay, so how does this relate to games? So NFTs are used very commonly in blockchain games. And one of the things to understand with blockchain games is that typically the game logic itself and the game play is not recorded on the blockchain. Most blockchain games is a traditional game, but the main difference is that the assets and any currency are in part or in whole managed via a blockchain. So if we look at this chart that I created, when you think about traditional games and you think about inventory management, a player's inventory, it's centralized, the game publisher manages that typically, and that controls what a player has or can use in the game. With blockchain, it's typically decentralized. Players can, game publishers can issue NFTs for game items, but typically users can take them out of the game and play, and they can also, in some cases, bring other assets into the game. And all that is managed via a blockchain instead of the publisher. With most traditional games, there's an in-game currency. It's a closed-loop currency, meaning you can purchase it, you can only use it in the game, and you can't typically legally sell it outside the platform. With a lot of blockchain games, there's a cryptocurrency that's used to purchase in-game assets. It's a convertible virtual currency. It's open loop. You can buy it through the publisher and or a marketplace. With the in-game item, again, those are typically closed loop. If a publisher issues game items, you purchase them, it goes into your inventory, you can use them in the game. With many blockchain games, there's NFT-based game items that, again, you can purchase either in-game or outside the game. In most games, the game publisher, their items are the only publisher of items for the game. With blockchain games, you see publishers issuing stuff, but you can also have third parties. So there's a lot of digital fashion created by third parties for avatars or other things that can be used in different games. One of the other differences is with the terms of service. So most traditional games, any assets that a player has, they get a limited license to use it in the game, and typically the terms of service prohibit resale outside the game. With blockchain games, as I mentioned earlier, assets can be typically bought and sold outside the game. And part of this kind of ties in then to the business model. With most games, the publisher, if they're selling digital items, they get a one-time license fee. They basically sell the item and the player can use it until either in some cases it's permanent, in some cases if it expires or is used, then they can go out and try to sell players another item. With blockchain games, if a publisher issues an NFT-based item and that item gets resold, they can get not just the initial fee, but they can get a resale royalty as well. One of the other big things I think from a business model perspective where blockchain games and traditional games are contrasted is kind of the overall business model. So with a lot of games, there's a lot of chance-based mechanics, loot boxes, and other things that have been very successfully monetized to generate revenue for the publishers. But these have led to a lot of gambling claims. In most cases, they haven't been successful in the US, but throughout the world, there's different treatment of loot boxes. So generally in the US, if gambling is, if someone pays some money or other consideration, and there's some chance-based element by which they can win a prize of value, that's gambling. In most of the cases that have been filed in the US, the traditional game companies have won by arguing that the in-game assets don't have any value because they can't be sold outside the game, and it only has entertainment value. And the courts have agreed with that. And when the publisher hasn't created or participated in a secondary market, the terms of service prohibit such sales, and the game is designed to be kind of closed loop. In that situation, courts have found that the in-game items are not a thing of value for gambling purposes, but they're just for entertainment. And so with blockchain games, obviously, that's all different, right? Since everything can be sold, this argument typically is not going to exist because the in-game items can be sold, and if they have value and you permit these types of mechanics, it's more likely that there'd be a finding of gambling. So what we're seeing with a lot of the blockchain games, in part because of this, is that many of the games, the business model is not based on loot boxes and other chance-based mechanics, but rather more play-to-earn and user-generated content-based monetization. And so these, of course, raise different issues, different than gambling, a lot of IP-related issues and certain other issues with financial regulatory issues like anti-money laundering and things like that. So that's just a quick overview of kind of games. There's a couple of articles here. We'll circulate this if you don't already have it. If anyone wants to look at some of these articles that kind of go into a little more depth on NFTs and blockchain games. But I think from here, we're going to go to the panel discussion.
Well, thank you very much, James. So we're going to have now the Q&A questions. I have a question for Patrick. So Patrick, can you talk a little bit more of the extraction of the metaverse in gaming? Hello, Patrick, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm sorry, I could not hear you.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more of the structure of the metaverse in video gaming?
Yeah, and thank you, Jim, for that overview of the blockchain and NFTs generally. I come at this from the pure gaming perspective. My background is deal making within traditional games, and we can talk a little bit about what a traditional game is. What I find now, and I've got about a half a dozen clients that are working in blockchain and NFT related games, and what I find is that the business model is coming first. Everybody's seeing the opportunity for whether it's resale royalties or large scale NFT minting and those opportunities, and that's going before what the game actually is and the balance of the game and a lot of that. It's less of a legal issue than I think it is more of a how a game is structured. I would argue that it's a very difficult proposition to have a very good storytelling gaming experience in what is inherently such an open playing field in the blockchain, right? It's a very open landscape. Everybody sees the opportunity, but that can be a blessing and a curse, because I think sometimes the deals are not understood by either side, or they're moving too fast. So I think finding the right blend of a game within the metaverse or within the blockchain is a difficult proposition. And there haven't been too many big successes yet. There's been some money made, but I don't think there's been a really great gaming experience yet. So I think, to answer your question about the structure of metaverse and games, I think that's still being written. On a basic level, as James said in the presentation, the structure of the game is very similar to the structure of games on any platform and throughout the past, obviously evolving from box product to subscriptions and whatnot. So most of my clients are in the business of creating the game or creating the digital asset that is then going to be put up for sale on the blockchain.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. My next question will be, what is the nature of video games? Are we talking about product, service? Are we talking about experience? What do you think of this? Oh, James, and then Patrick.
Yeah, well, I think it can be all of the above and some combinations of it. I think just to kind of follow on a bit to what Patrick said, I do think that with blockchain games, as typical of kind of this whole decentralization that's happening with Web3, I think that a lot of the things that historically have worked to make good games may not work with blockchain-based games. I think one of the big characteristics that we're seeing as a result of some of the business models and some of the things that have worked so far to at least a limited extent for blockchain games, it's much more community-based, it's much more user-generated. It's not 100% centralized controlled by video game publishers, and that's a big change from what has historically been the case. And I think probably the best things we'll see have not even been thought about yet, because I think people are just experimenting with it, as Patrick said, and trying to get their head around it and see what works. But there's a lot of different aspects of what's going on with blockchain games. That there's people are doing like more like, you think about like Roblox, for example, which the whole user-generated content part, while that may or may not be a metaverse depending how you define it, that's really taking off. And I think you're going to see elements of that in other games that really work. And we also see, like within Roblox, there's concerts. So I think you have to have a service, entertainment. There's there can be other elements that are like maybe not the direct part of the game, but relate to it, that will be also very popular, which again play into the whole community creation. And there's a lot of different elements that go in other than just pure gameplay that I think we're going to see in these blockchain-based games.
Thank you. Patrick?
Yeah, I agree. I think it makes it more difficult to set the parameters of that storytelling experience and whatever it is, but it's not impossible. Like I said, Fortnite's done it with the experiences that they have within the game, and others like Roblox, like James had mentioned. It's whether it's a product or a service or experience, the answer, it's all the above. I mean, games has evolved before the blockchain into all the above. The concern has always been, even back with microtransactions or subscription-based games, that were outside of the blockchain. The concern has always been the balance, right? If the user feels like the only way to do anything fun in the game is to spend money, or if they're getting hit over the head constantly to monetize, the user gets turned off. And that's been the case for 25 years. And I don't think it's going to be any different in the blockchain. So finding that balance, I think, is difficult. And I think the first wave of games that we're seeing in the blockchain are really sort of, I don't want to say guinea pigs, because that's probably too strong a word, but it's throwing a lot of things out there to see what works and what doesn't. And I think the next generation of games will probably iterate better off of that, because a lot of times, even a lot of my developer clients, they don't want to work on blockchain-based games. So management of those studios has to thread a fine line there about what projects they're even taking on, because there is this sort of stigma that that a blockchain-based game is really a pure money grab, and it's not really a game experience. So a lot of the programmers and a lot of the animators are hesitant to even work on it because they don't necessarily know themselves if a good game can be made for the blockchain yet. But it's coming. It will happen.
Okay. Okay, another question. What are some of the IP considerations for commercial licensing of digital assets associated with NFTs? James first.
Yeah, so this whole concept of commercial licensing is really interesting. You know, it kind of bucks the trend of historical licensing in these contexts. Most of the time, as I mentioned, if you have a pre-existing brand or you know, kind of a game publisher, you typically get a limited license to use an item in game, or even just more broadly, what we're seeing with NFTs, even outside of games, is that typically, if it's digital art or some other digital asset, is users get this limited right just to display it. It could be a PFP, profile picture, or something else. But we've seen, like, I think probably the best scenario that we've seen so far, where there's been commercial license rights granted to a digital asset, and it's created an incredible amount of value for the organization, is the Bored Ape Yacht Club. So Yuga Labs, which is the originator of Bored Ape, they granted a commercial license to the apes that were part of this 10,000 picture series that people use as their PFP, but people have created all kinds of things around the apes using the commercial license rights. So there's one company it created a restaurant in Long Beach, California. It's called Bored and Hungry, and it's a burger chain or a burger restaurant. I think it's just one of them right now. There's another that created the Bored Breakfast Club that's using the ape brand, and they created 5,000 new tokens, and all the token holders get free coffee. And they sell this coffee to other people, and there's other benefits that go along with it. And what they do is take a percentage of the resale of all the coffee they sell and all the resale royalties on the NFTs that they generated that are resold. And every time that community pot gets to a certain amount, they end up issuing new brands and sending new coffee out to the token holders. There's people that are taking like some of these Bored Apes and creating a backstory to them, and then creating a band, and they're going to do a publishing label based on this. So many other examples. So people are taking these single images and creating brands around them. And so you ask, what are the IP considerations? What's interesting is, you know, Yuga Labs was born as an NFT company. They had no pre-existing IP, no pre-existing revenue. They created these apes, and they were successful. They became even more successful. And now, as people are commercializing them, there's ways in which Yuga is now further monetizing what they've done. They've done some ancillary products where they did the Bored Ape Kennel Club. So if you owned an ape, you could buy the NFT that had similar characteristics to your ape. They did this other thing where they had these digital serums that they sold that you could mix with your ape and create an ape with new characteristics, another whole series of NFTs. They collect all the resale royalties on those. They've created this Ape Fest, so they're doing like now a real life brand where they're doing you know, in-person you know, festivals around ape aspects, and they just raised $450 million at a $4.5 billion valuation, I believe. And all of it started with the apes and granting that commercial license, and now they're creating a bunch of ancillary businesses around it. Whereas what we're seeing with a lot of traditional brands, like, for example, the high-end fashion brands that are creating NFTs for avatars to wear, because there's either typically trademark or some like famous pattern that there's already pre-existing IP that covers, and there's revenue associated with that IP in other contexts, those brands are granting very limited licenses. So I think it's really interesting to see this dichotomy of how traditional brands that have revenue and IP are issuing, you know, these limited licenses as a way to try to just do brand marketing more so than making a lot of money, at least for now. Whereas some of these NFT companies that are born that way, they're using NFTs to create a brand and generate revenue. So it's pretty interesting contrast.
Thank you. Patrick?
Yeah, and I think adding on to that, so my work tends to be not in that line. My work tends to be more upstream or downstream, I guess it depends on how you look at it, with the folks that are being commissioned to create the asset, right? For either one of them, whether it's for the brand or whatnot. So my considerations are different than the brand or Bored Ape. My considerations are making sure that if there is a revenue split, that revenue split is apples to apples and not apples to oranges as far as whether what it ties to to the commercial license, what's included, what's not, ownership of the asset, obviously making sure contractually they get paid for their work, and adjusting or sort of guiding them through the business considerations of working in this sort of, I guess, new supply chain, right? So that is what we're doing on the contract basis. So the contracts are not that incredibly different for the service providers, the people who are making the games, or the outsourcing partners for the games. Just slightly different considerations to match up with the commercial license on the NFT side.
Perfect. How did you create an enforceable license for NFTs, James?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and one that I think the thinking about it has and is continuing to evolve a bit. So, generally under contract law, you can do electronic contracting, and in the US, the courts have basically said that in order to have a binding agreement, the end user needs to affirmatively accept the license or terms of service, whatever is applicable. And so we've seen that in many cases where a user is required to check, I agree, or I agree to these terms of service with a link to the terms of service when they're creating an account or making a purchase or at other appropriate time. If that happens, the courts will typically enforce that contract. Whereas if you have merely a terms of service at the bottom of the page and the user is not required to look at it or accept it, in some cases, courts won't. So with NFTs, they're sold in different ways and in different places. I mean, sometimes they're sold within a game or other, kind of privately controlled offering. And there may be license terms in the terms of service. And if a user accepts the terms of service, they may be inherently accepting the license that goes with the NFT. The problem with putting license terms in a terms of service, it's hard to customize the license. You may have different classes of NFTs that have different licenses. So what we're seeing is, in many cases, with the NFTs where we're representing the issuers, we're trying to ensure that wherever that NFT is marketed, whether it's a marketplace or the client's own website, if they're selling it through a website or other service offering of the client, that when they present the NFT, they have the checkbox that says, by buying this NFT, I agree to this NFT owner license. And if there's the affirmative acceptance, then that likely would be deemed binding. The other challenge that arises with respect to NFTs, though, as we've touched on, is NFTs are inherently resellable. I mean, they're designed to be that way. So if Patrick buys an NFT in one of the games, and later I want to purchase that from him, he could sell it to me directly. He could list it on a marketplace, or if I know he has it and I want it, I could make him an offer and he could sell it to me. And so if he goes to resell it to me and there's no marketplace or nowhere where there's a listing, the question is, how do you ensure that license is then binding on me if I don't have to accept it? And that's where there's been a challenge in the industry right now. One of the things that we do is, a lot of people recommend putting at least a link to the license in the metadata of the NFT. I think that's a good idea, but probably not by itself sufficient, because most purchasers aren't looking at the metadata and it doesn't require an affirmative acceptance, but at least the license is there and it's one thing you can point to. I think what we've been doing, and this hasn't been tried in court, is, under traditional copyright law, you can do a conditional transfer clause in a license, right? So basically what we say is, if you own the NFT, you can resell the token. If you sell the token, your license to the asset terminates, but the license is transferable to a purchaser if certain conditions are met. And typically the conditions would include, as the seller, you have to present the license to the buyer and they have to accept it. In practice, a lot of people probably won't do that, but if that's what's required, if the subsequent purchaser says, I never accepted this license, then they don't have any right, right? Because you own the underlying copyright. And for them to have a right to use it, they typically need the license. And so we'll see how that plays out. I mean, similar to how a lot of open source licenses, there's no affirmative acceptance. And some of those have been, kind of approved in court because the underlying work is copyrighted, the code is copyrighted. And if you don't accept the license, you don't have a right to make modifications or redistribute it. So, it's an analogous argument as to what worked in the open source realm. So I think those are some challenges. One of the things, the last thing I'll say is that there's a number of companies, and we're working with one of them, a company called Mintangible, that's trying to create like a technology layer in the minting platforms and marketplaces and other parts of the NFT ecosystem, that each time an NFT is sold, the smart contract will require the license to be presented to the purchaser and accepted before the sale will go through. So I think we might ultimately get some legal decisions that help how to make this enforceable from a legal perspective, and or some technology solutions that might assist as well.
Thank you, James. Patrick?
Yeah, again, coming at this from a layered down perspective on the service providers and the code developers that are creating some of these assets, it's a challenge, because if the challenge up a notch is to create an enforceable license, then the challenge on my side is to make sure my clients know going in that you don't necessarily know how that's going to work and how you're going to get paid, right? On downstream revenue. So so we're always looking at some of the ways to structure our contracts. I mean, on a more basic level, don't count on all that downstream revenue, right? I'm not sure you can. Don't get greedy. Take as much money off the table as you can early on in the creation of some assets or some of the devs. Honestly, with the way things are going right now, in this wave of games, if I'm a developer of a game who's partnering with a blockchain or based game publisher, I tell my client right now, put a buffer in your development budget and take your money that way more than you take it on a rev share side, because you can't bank on that, right? Your upside's higher, but are you prepared for zero upside, right? There's a bigger swing there. So structuring the contracts according to the uncertainty that James has identified, I think is one of my challenges, and it's an ongoing one.
Perfect. And our last question will be, what are the intellectual property issues associated with avatars? I mean, trademark rights, right of publicity. James?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and the answer is there can be many. Let me start with trademark rights. So one of the things that, for those of you who are familiar with Second Life, there was a woman, I think her name was Amy Weber. I don't know if that was a real name or in-world name, but she had created an avatar, and she actually conducted services within the Second Life platform. And she actually got a trademark for her avatar because she was offering services through the avatar. And so I think that was one of the first where the avatar itself was trademarked. So there can be trademark rights in avatar. Right of publicity is kind of a huge area with respect to NFTs, whether they're NFT-based avatars or pictures of celebrities that are tied to NFTs. Most people are probably aware right of publicity, at least in the U.S., is typically either state law or common law. There's not really a federal right to right of publicity. And there's, I think, a number of misconceptions about right of publicity and copyright. And people often, I think, confuse the two. In my mind, they're different. And one simple example is, if I'm a photographer and I legally take a picture of Patrick, he's a very famous game attorney. If he has right of publicity, I take a picture and I sell his picture at a Video Game Bar Association conference. Because I took the picture, as long as I took it legally, I didn't, sneak onto his land or something. I do it in public. I own the copyright in that picture, even though it's an image of him. And if Patrick says, hey, this is a cool image, and he wants to put it on his website, he doesn't have a right to do it without my permission. There's a number of celebrities who have been sued for copyright infringement for putting up a picture of themselves taken by someone else who owns the copyright. And so celebrities' right of publicity is not based on copyright. It's based on this state law or common law right, where if someone takes the name, image, or likeness, or in some cases voice or mannerisms or other attributes that are associated with that celebrity, and use those, one or more of those items to sell other goods or services, then that typically is when there's a right of publicity issue, because that typically would be deemed to be, viewed as the celebrity endorsing that good or service. And of course, if they haven't done that, then you're misusing their right to commercialize their name, image, and likeness. And so in the context of NFTs, we've seen a number of lawsuits already where people have tried to create NFTs based on celebrities, whether it's for games or for just digital images. And I think there's an interesting looming legal question here about what is an NFT. So as I mentioned earlier, you have the token part and the asset part. And if the asset includes an image of a celebrity, right? Let's just stick to the picture for a second instead of the avatar. Does the token just represent ownership of a license that a photographer granted in that image? Or is the NFT itself something different? Is it a separate product? And there's a pending case right now that may provide some guidance as to how courts look at what an NFT is. The case is Nike versus StockX, and StockX does this service where they take high-end physical items and they verify the authenticity. And one of the things they do this for is high-end sneakers. And so they once they verify the authenticity, they have the physical sneakers and they can list them and sell them, but they sell it with an NFT that includes an image of the sneakers and a certificate saying it's authentic. And Nike sued them and said that by creating this additional image in addition to the picture of the physical product, that they're infringing various rights that Nike has. And in this case, one of the issues that I think is interesting to watch is that StockX is saying that the NFT, the token, is just like a digital receipt. It's like the automobile title. It just shows that you own something, and in this case, it's a license to that digital asset, or you own the underlying sneaker. Whereas Nike is saying you're selling the sneaker plus a virtual product. They're saying the NFT itself is another product. It's a digital product, and by selling that product without permission, that it's violating various of Nike's IP rights. So I think part of this goes to with the avatars. When you have an NFT-based avatar, what are you really selling? Is it just the digital work, or is the NFT-based avatar a new product? And so if there's celebrity images there, then the question is, is there a right of publicity issue? Is there a copyright issue, or any other IP issues that may arise?
Thank you, James. Patrick?
Yeah, and I think James said it perfectly. And again, coming at it from somebody who represents clients who are often subcontracted to create those assets, I'm looking at strong indemnities. I'm looking at, affirmative reps and warranties that, we're being directed to perform services that they have the rights to, things along those lines that tie into that, because, it's a concern. We don't always know, and we don't want, we don't want the blockchain company that commissioned my company to do something that, runs and hides or goes out of business, and somehow we get left holding the bag for, for an infringement action. So we're looking to allocate that risk in the deals that we do up the ladder into the blockchain.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So we open the question to the public. Pueden hacer las preguntas en español. Ellos tienen.
Or you can ask in English. They have direct interpretation. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand.
Question will be, who owns the avatar? I mean, the publisher, the user, no one?
Well, it depends on the contract that Patrick wrote for it. So again, many times if there's an NFT-based avatar, the user will have a license to use the avatar. Often the underlying copyright will be owned by whoever created the digital instantiation of the avatar. And if the avatar resembles a celebrity, there may be right of publicity that the celebrity has in that as well. And potentially there could be trademark rights, as I mentioned, in the context of like the Amy Weber situation.
Okay. ¿Alguna pregunta?
Any question? Thank you very much to the speakers for this panel. My question for any one of you is related to the NFT collections that are made with the generative art technique. This is art created through the artificial intelligence rules. If that, from the copyright point of view, can present an issue as far as the originality of the work of art and its protection.
We might need you to restate the question if you could, please.
Did you get the question? No?
No, if you could restate that, I'd appreciate it. We couldn't hear it all.
Bien, en relación a la...
So it's regarding NFT collections that are created based on generative art. These are works of art generated through artificial intelligence. Can that have a consequence related to its protection as far as its originality? And since these works of art are not created by human beings.
NFT that are created by artificial intelligence, it can pose any challenge to the protection of copyright?
Yes. So there's a lot of issues floating around with AI and some of these generative art projects that are used upon which NFTs are created. In most jurisdictions, an AI, a bot, or an AI model cannot be a copyright owner. But I think that the reality is I have some clients that are doing these generative projects, and the way they typically work is the artist starts with some images and they identify different characteristics of the images. It could be accessories or body parts or whatever, the whole set of things that they specify that can vary from one image to the next. And so they're providing certain input, and they may provide even greater detail about how they can vary, whether it's color, size, other attributes. And so once they specify all that, the AI tool is used to generate multiple images, but according to the artist's specifications. And I think what's interesting is that pure AI, if you just have a program say, hey, create some art, and you start with nothing but a model, I think it's going to be very hard to protect that because there's no human creative input. And that seems to be the test in most of the world right now. But for a long time, many artists have used tools and technology to create art, to assist them in creating art, whether it's how light is shaded or shadows or other things that are not human generated, but they're human specified. And so I think, there's going to be a growing number of cases. In fact, there was one, I saw just a headline just this morning. There was someone in the US that filed for copyright registration for some AI generated art, and they were refused by the Copyright Office, and they've now filed an appeal of that, and that appeal is pending. There was a case, I believe, in Australia where a similar situation, and I think there was an interim finding where the artist was able to get protection through the AI, and then I think that was overturned. So I think the short answer is there's not a bright line test. I mean, artists have used technology for a long time. AI is just another form of technology. And I think ultimately, if there's some level of input or specification that includes creativity by the artist, at least some aspect of AI-generated art should be protectable by the artist. Whether we'll get to the point where copyright offices grant protection for the AI part of what was generated, I think that is probably a little more doubtful, but maybe we'll get there eventually.
Thank you. Patrick, you had something to add?
No, I don't. it's a scary proposition that I'm still getting my head around too.
Yeah, it's a tricky question. So, tenemos tiempo. We have time for my last question. Marcelo. No, perdón.
Guillermo.
What tendency do you see in terms of decentralized or centralized metaverse for gaming? Do you see interoperability as a must and that the companies will have to connect themselves and agree on protocols? Or you foresee that the companies will try to cope certain markets and be a little more restricted? So how interoperability is going to work? And what are the challenges there?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot more talk about interoperability than there actually is on interoperability at this point. I think that there's, likely there's things that will be interoperable, I think more so than the metaverses themselves. And by that I mean the following, is that like with NFTs right now, there's different protocols and different standards. And if you follow one of those standards, your NFTs can be displayed in multiple locations. I think that you'll see, at least for certain items, particularly like digital fashion, I think it makes a lot of sense that if you have an avatar in different metaverses, you should be able to wear that fashion in whatever metaverse you want. I know a lot of the digital brands we work with are trying to push that. But the true like global view of like all the metaverses will be connected to create one big metaverse, I think is way far off if it ever happens. And I think the thought of having your avatar be able to go from one metaverse to another, I think it'll take at least a fair amount of time to get there. So for right now, for the most part, you have different avatars in different metaverses, and that's kind of the state of where we are right now.
Patrick?
Yeah, I think it's really going to depend on the companies and how they view their products and offerings too, right? You're not going to see anytime soon Blizzard allowing avatars to come into World of Warcraft that look like a Marvel character, right? I mean, it's each company has a different viewpoint of their user experience, and I know for a fact that Blizzard's is very closed and very very cautious about anything that affects that player experience. So each one's going to have their own mentality about how they approach that. There will be a lot that are interconnected. Some that will probably never get interconnected. But the ones that are willing to do it, I agree with James. It's going to take a long time.
Perfect. Bien, estamos ahora. Le damos.
Very well, and we thank you all for participating.
Patrick, realmente un panel muy interesante.
It's been a very interesting panel, and any question pending, we will then share their email. That way you can send them that question. And thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you, Aldo. Now let's go have lunch. We have 1 hour through 13:40. Lunch is in the same place as yesterday in the courtyard. And very quick. It's a light, not that we don't want to feed you enough, but we want to finish early. That way you have good part of the afternoon to enjoy. So we'll reconvene at 13:40. And to new members, the certificates, those who haven't yet collected your certificate, it's at the Secretariat.